On Orialis Station, the galaxy's brightest students gathered to study the most sacred relics in existence, artifacts their civilizations had worshipped for centuries, puzzles no mind had ever solved. Professors wrote papers, committees argued, and entire careers were built on the mystery. And then a human exchange student, a business major named Ethan Walker, picked one up, turned it in his hands, and opened it, by accident. What followed was the academic meltdown of the millennium. Orialis Station drifted above a pale blue gas giant like a jeweled brooch that had been pinned to the velvet of space at a slightly anxious angle. Everything on Orialis had been designed by committee. The atriums were tasteful, the corridors were wide enough for six-legged administrators to pass without saying "excuse me," and even the announcement chimes sounded like they'd been optimized not to offend anyone's sensibilities. It was a prestige hub, an orbital campus for researchers who measured their lives in citations and departmental gossip, and if you listened carefully, you could hear the subtle hum of 1,000 reputations maintaining orbit. Lecture Hall 16 was full before the doors finished opening. Students from 20-odd species arranged themselves into their preferred learning formations. Some unfolded trestle limbs and stacked notes in precise spires. Others secreted comfortable gels and oozed into seated approximation. One moonstepper inflated a translucent hovering bladder and bobbed politely at the back. On the stage, Professor Marr stood with the practiced stillness of someone who loved being looked at. Marr was a Kaelith. Bipedal, chitinous plates lacquered to a meticulous sheen, antennae curled like quotation marks. His robes were the institutional violet reserved for senior faculty, who could, on any given day, get a building named after them by nodding at the right committee. "Welcome, students, to Advanced Xeno-Relic Analysis," he said, and somehow the acoustics gave him a small halo of authority. "I am Professor Marr. For 49 cycles, I have devoted my work to artifacts whose mechanisms predate our language for describing them." In the front row, Sarai of Glassward, a Clithian whose crystalline skin sluiced colors like a prism, adjusted to a posture that could have broken lesser vertebrae. Her stylus moved before the professor spoke anything worth noting. Her GPA hovered at the speed of light, and she saw no reason for it to slow down. Next to her, Tivrek, a Quan engineer with 4 eyes arranged in a tidy rhombus, unpacked an arsenal of pocket instruments. Calibration rods clicked gently into place. A microspectrometer purred. He lined up 17 devices in a row, alphabetized by the manufacturer's warranty. 2 rows back, Yilth, a Thrin with 4 expressive tendrils in constant negotiation with oxygen, vibrated with a level of anticipatory terror usually reserved for meteorological events. If someone had whispered the word quiz, he'd have fainted on principle. At the very rear, alone in a continent of empty seats, sat Ethan Walker, human, exchange student. Jagged half of one shoulder, laces untied, the kind of posture that said, "I'm fully committed to being here until I'm not." His application to Orialis had been a practical thing, cheaper than the Mars campus, better cafeteria, and the promise of seeing a gas giant do its slow pirouette outside the dorm windows. In the first week, he'd learned to navigate the translation implants, the escalators that sometimes decided stairs were elitist, and the way everyone looked at him with polite curiosity. He liked the station in a mild way, reserved for airports and hotel lobbies. He missed grilled cheese. Professor Marr, reaching for his favorite audience, extended a lower hand beneath the podium and produced the piece that justified his entire personality. "Behold," he said, lifting it high like a benediction, "the Kaelith Enigma box." It fit his hands like it had been built for them, metallic, the color of forged storm cloud, etched in fine geometric patterns that refused to sit still under the light. The air in the room changed. It sounded like reverence looks. "This puzzle has confounded scholarship for 3 millennia," Marr continued, savouring the vowel on millennia. "Scholars from 20 species, 49 interlocking mechanisms, extinct dialects embedded in the grain of its components. There are temporal considerations we only discuss in closed colloquia. It is, to be plain, a cathedral in the shape of a cube." Sarai's eyes brightened until they hissed softly. Tivrek's scanners spun up to a discreet whine. Yilth's tendrils tied themselves in a fretful knot and then attempted to untie the knot and then apologized to the knot. "Over the course of this term," Marr said, placing the box on a demonstration plinth with a tenderness usually reserved for newborn planets, "we will not open it. We will learn why it cannot be opened. Understanding the limits of knowledge is knowledge. Your safety protocols are as follows." Ethan yawned, a quiet, apologetic yawn into his sleeve. Across species, a few heads turned. Humans always sounded like they were swallowing rain when they yawned. Marr breathed through it. "Never touch the artifact. The Kaelith Enigma is believed to house a temporal displacement haze. Incorrect pressure could distort the interface lattice. We observe. We do not handle. We respect Orialis Station, hummed softly through the walls, the transit ring guiding a shuttle home, a regulator compensating for a heat spike, someone's tea arriving at precisely 91 degrees. Ethan slouched lower and tried to estimate how long a lecture could last when the lecturer had waited half a century to give it. Spoiler, long enough for lunch to become an endangered concept. Professor Marr placed a gentle hand on the Enigma's open petal, as if to demonstrate that he could, in fact, touch it now without dissolving into shame. "With respect," he said quietly, reverent in a new way, "perhaps we should ask Mr. Walker to show us how to close them without forgetting how to open them." Ethan looked at the human thing he had done and the alien thing he had been asked to keep doing. He thought of the noodle place in Ring 3 and the gas giant turning like a giant's eye outside the station, and the way the Enigma had felt in his hands like a puzzle that wanted to be solved. "Okay," he said. "Quick lesson, then lunch." They gathered close. Sarai, stylus poised but no longer trembling. Tivrek, for once not interposing a device between himself and the world. Yilth, tendrils steady, eyes wide. The dean leaned in, the impossible luxury of attention fully offered. Marr listened like a man who had finally met the language his cathedral was written in. "Rule 1, Ethan said, hands hovering over the Enigma's petals. "Don't treat it like a temple. Treat it like a wrench." Sarai wrote it down. Then, on a fresh page, in large letters, "Wrench." "And rule 2? Tivrek asked. Ethan smiled. "If you hear hoofbeats," he said, because some traditions deserve to be shared, "think horses." "Not razor beasts," Yilth whispered, and drew a horse that, this time, looked like it might carry you somewhere. The alarms kept murmuring, polite as always. The gas giant rolled its slow, glorious eye. Orialis Station, with its committees and chimes, adjusted to a future that had become a little less sacred and a lot more useful. And Ethan Walker, human, business major, soon to be restaurateur, showed the greatest minds in a dozen star systems how to close a box without losing the nerve to open it again. He taught quickly. He left before anyone could ask him to stay. He found his friends. He ate noodles with the blunt joy of a person who has earned starch. Later, much later, he made grilled cheese for a table full of aliens who had never thought bread could be persuasive. Back in Lecture Hall 16, Professor Marr stood alone with the quiet machines. He looked at the wooden box on the corner, the lunchbox older than some nations, and he laughed, softly and well, in a way that did not need a committee's approval. "We have been making temples," he said to the low hum of a station that had agreed to keep orbiting. "Time to build workshops." He reached out and turned off the last hologram. The room darkened to an honest shade. Outside the window, the planet turned. Inside the window, a curriculum turned with it. And far down the ring, in a restaurant that did not exist yet, but would, months from now, a bell would someday chime. A human would flip a sandwich. A Kaelith professor would sit at a corner table with a Helok dean and a Clithian student and a Quorn engineer and a Thrin who had drawn so many horses he forgot what fear felt like. They would argue about tools, they would argue about temples, they would eat, they would hum to the cutlery, because that is how you learn what it wants to be. On Orialis Station, in the orbit of a patient gas giant, the future arrived with a click. "I just pushed the bit that wanted to move," he said. Serai's stylus froze mid-character. The motion etched a bright plateau into the composite. Tivrek's nearest device emitted a defeated florp and turned itself off. Yilth's tendrils went rigid in a gesture that meant, "I have reached my daily allowance of reality." "Straightforward," Marr said, and he made the word sound like a slur. "The Kaelith Enigma is a cathedral of interlocks. It is designed to rebuke arrogance. Ethan considered this with honest interest." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's a really nice box." The lecture hall became a scene from a well-funded documentary. Serai took command as if a command had been a course she'd aced. She produced clipboards until it seemed likely she had a small manufacturing facility under her seat. Tivrek rearranged his devices in a perfect circle around the plinth, his four eyes flicking between readouts like a conductor improvising a symphony for alarm bells. Yilth, having entered a quiet meltdown, lay a tendril across his notebook as if to apologize to it for what was happening nearby. "Walker," Serai said, and Ethan had not consented to be Walker, but it suited the moment. "We are going to replicate your actions step by step. Baseline first." She handed him a training cube, a teaching aid designed to give nervous students the illusion of control. It did nothing, because it was designed to do nothing in a satisfying way. "Grip pressure, standard," Tivrek narrated. "Exploratory passes, consistent. No anomalous haptics. Human epidermal sensitivity readings within known variants." Serai swapped to a true device. A palm-sized puzzle with 3 visible seams and a mischievous weight. Ethan rotated it in his hands, counting out nothing in particular. He pressed where the heat slept, twisted where resistance suggested an argument that could be resolved by kindness, and the puzzle opened with a bell-like chord that probably meant thank you. "How did you identify the activation point?" Professor Marr demanded, rushing forward and then stopping 6 centimeters away like the edge of a cliff, warmer than the surrounding surface. Ethan shrugged. "And that bit felt squishier, like there's a membrane behind it." "We scanned for thermal differentials for 6 weeks, Serai said, and her voice did a quiver she would deny in any court. "We found none." "Your scanners are too sensitive," Ethan said, with the unstudied confidence of someone who had once fixed a vending machine by looking at it. "You're averaging out the thing you're trying to find. Sometimes you just touch the thing." It was a sentence that, had he put it on a grant application, would have gotten him politely escorted out. In person, in the wake of a miracle, it landed like scripture. "Next," Serai said, not trusting her own mouth with commentary. She presented a crystalline polyhedron hedgehogged in glowing runes. "The Zerelian memory core, sealed 5,000 years. There are 37 papers arguing about whether it even opens." Ethan took the polyhedron and cocked his head like he was listening to a neighbor's music through the wall. He touched a rune, then another, Then several more, not at random, but not like that. He began to hum. It wasn't a tune anyone could name, but it was the sort of melody that made potted plants stand up straighter. The runes warmed in reply. He adjusted his humming until the harmonics agreed with his skin. 30 seconds later, the polyhedron carved itself into petals, and a ribbon of light unspooled into the air, arranging itself into an index of symbols, diagrams, and what might have been recipes. "Library," Ethan said simply. "Doors are songs." "Those harmonics don't exist," Tivrek said, breathless. "Or, rather, they do, but not in any of the catalogued modal systems. How did you decide the starting frequency?" "Same way you find the key of a song," Ethan said. "You listen until it stops sounding wrong." Yilth made a soft "oh" of misery. "I have been using math," he whispered. "Math is nice," Ethan said kindly. "It just isn't everything." They tried him with more. The Kargan spindle, a lattice that required 6 hands to hold properly if you believed the manuals. Ethan rolled it across his knuckles like a coin trick, and it unfolded into a star map that smelled faintly of citrus. Yilth wrote "smell," and then underlined it 3 times and then applied a cold compress to his own head. The Vortuk harmonic sphere, rumoured to contain a dangerous resonance. Ethan whistled 3 notes that made half the instruments try to recalibrate themselves, and the sphere sighed open like a door on a summer porch. Tivrek's largest scanner printed a receipt's worth of protest and then displayed "I don't know" in 6 languages. The precursor knot, which had never responded to any input. Ethan pressed it, and nothing happened. He pressed it again, harder. Still nothing. He held it, turned it, listened, and then handed it back. "That one's a paperweight," he said. Professor Marr's face did an interesting thing. "Excuse me?" "Pretty patterns. No mechanism. Decorative. It's good work," Ethan added, because the craftsman in his fingers respected whoever had carved it. "Just not a thing." 43 years, Marr said faintly to the ceiling. "It's been on the syllabus for 43 years. Word travelled faster than light when it had help. The hall's doors thrummed with bodies, faces pressed to the glass, cameras blinked their unblinking little eyes. A maintenance unit trundled up to scold the crowd, and instead extended a periscope to watch. Someone started a rumour that the human was emitting a new kind of radiation. Someone else started betting on whether the human would explode. Sarai, who understood the narrative value of a timeline, began writing on the board. Kaelith Enigma, opened by touch, 1217. Zirelian core, hummed open, 1226. Kargan spindle, star map now citrus-scented, 1234. Harmonic sphere, responded to whistling, 1241. Precursor knot, paperweight, I guess, 1245. Tivrek added data that might eventually forgive him for not throwing himself out an airlock when the paradox puzzle showed up. Yilth wrote, "Stop thinking," in reverent nouns, and if someone had been looking, they'd have seen the first wobble in his tendrils flatten. A security officer nosed in, saw nothing on fire, saw the dean was on her way, and decided the situation was above his uniform. He stayed, because it was also very interesting, and texted a group chat, "You are not going to believe this," and then, after a moment, "No, really." Sarai produced a final object wrapped in bureaucracy's favourite cloth. The Lithian tide heart. "We've never observed a reaction, but it registers as important." Ethan held it like a bar of soap. It tried to be slippery. He smiled at it, which was absurd, and it stopped trying and opened. "Oh, for Sarai said, and snapped another stylus clean in two. When Archdean Relvar entered a room, the room looked around to see if it was everything it ought to be. Relvar was a hellock, 6 long legs, each joint moving with a predator's economy, 4 arms nested like cutlery, a thorax armoured in matte black that made the station's polite lighting hesitate about reflecting off it. Her compound eyes tracked 17 things simultaneously and were kind enough to let you believe you were the most important. She wore the dark silver sash of someone who could sign for a starship and be back before lunch. "I have received," she said, and the room quieted down in an evolutionary flinch. "Reports of temporal anomalies, protocol breaches, and a student who hums at the furniture until ancient technology begs to be relevant. Explain." Professor Marr gestured with all available limbs to the plinth, which now resembled an altar mid-revival. The Kaelith Enigma was still in its patient bloom. The memory core sang quietly to itself. The harmonic sphere spun in a way that made Tivrek giddy and nauseated at once. "The human," Marr said, bracing for a bolt of administrative lightning, "opened the Enigma." Relvar looked at Ethan. 10,000 years of institutional patience stared through her and paused. "Your name?" "Ethan Walker," he said, and because he was human, he added, "Ma'am," which translated as a word that made 3 species in the audience suddenly want to stand straighter and call their mothers. Relvar reached into her sash and drew out a twisted length of glimmering alloy whose geometry upset a few old philosophers in the back of the hall. "The temporal paradox construct," she said. "We have owned it for 2 centuries. The mathematics to resolve it do not exist yet. Open it." Ethan took it. It was not cold. It was worse. It felt indifferent in the way a difficult knot is indifferent to your feelings. He closed his eyes, not because that helped anything, but because the audience did. He mapped tension with his fingertips. He found where the metal wanted to move and where it needed to be persuaded. He breathed out. He moved the piece not where it looked like it belonged, but where it uncomplainingly went. The construct sighed, a noise like a pressure differential exhaling. Layers uncurled in impossible directions, and the air above it filled with equations that had been waiting there all along. A few of them were courteously polite enough to solve themselves in an order that wouldn't frighten Yilth. "It's not a paradox," Ethan said, opening his eyes. "It looks like one because the spatial frame cheats. It makes you think you're going in circles so you'll argue with yourself instead of the problem." Relvar's eyes stopped with a small click that read, "As astonishment to 3 species and mild flirtation to 1. And this is intuitive to you." "Kind of like untying a shoelace from the wrong end," Ethan said. "It complains until you go the way it wanted in the first place." Shoelace. Sarai wrote shoelace, earth-binding mechanism, in the margin of a very serious notebook. She underlined it because she felt instinctively that it meant something about humans and how they trick the universe into staying on their feet. Relvar set the construct down with ceremony, as if afraid it might say something unkind if treated casually. "Professor Marr, how long have we approached these relics as sacred objects rather than as designed tools?" Marr's antennae wilted. 49 years, he said, which was almost the same as my whole life, but less embarrassing. And the core, 63 in the department. And the construct, 212. "We have a lounge named after the endowment that acquired it," he said, "because suffering is better with a plaque." Relvar regarded Ethan like an interesting meteor. "Human, when you look at these artifacts, what do you see?"
"Tools," he said immediately. "Really well-made ones. Built by people who wanted other people to use them. You deduced intent from feel. Tivrek gave the word an academic haircut. Ethan shrugged. Back home we've got a saying, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not, he trailed off, caught between species. Not razor beasts. Yilth wrote horses' approximately standard explanation and drew a small horse badly, but with affection. Relvar was very still for a very long time. Professor Marr, convene a curriculum committee, she said at last, and the words were as gentle as a guillotine. Burn it down and rebuild it. The premise is wrong. Marr nodded, small and multiple. Yes, Archdean. She turned back to Ethan. You have bought us centuries, she said matter-of-factly. Possibly more. I prefer to pay debts immediately. You will require resources. Ethan smiled the way people smile at free puppies and staggering responsibility. No, that's okay. I'm actually a business major. He got the sentence out before the room remembered how to inhale. The hours that followed were the career highlights of 36 people and the worst day in the life of several cherished theories. They called it, because Sarai understood branding, the breakthrough table. Atop it sat 17 artifacts in various stages of having given up. The Kaelith Enigma remained open, projecting a dignified interface that no one had thought to ask for, because they'd never imagined they were allowed to. The Zirelian core streamed a catalogue into the air, a slow, patient waterfall of symbols sorting themselves into libraries whose indices begged for a student assistant. The harmonic sphere rotated slowly on an axis that temporarily broke a department's definition of an axis, and then offered to show a more helpful one. Dean Relvar checked off items on a slate that was normally used to approve building maintenance. It felt like a suitable reuse. Crystalline matrix of Vortec, she read, extracting a lattice from a padded case. Previously studied, 87 years. Ethan held it. The matrix whispered in the particular language of tense joints. He moved 3 arms of it, reversed 2, and tugged the final segment free with a sound like a jar surrendering its lid. A 4-dimensional topology flowered into the air, layered and gentle and immediately comprehensible if you looked at it with your elbow. 14 minutes, Sarai said, astonished and annoyed at the same time. She had wanted it to be 15 for symmetry and humility. The data flood was biblical. Tivrek's devices were not built to record miracles and protested by overheating in polite order, like theatre patrons excusing themselves row by row. He began taking notes by hand, which felt like sin, but looked like salvation. "What's the trick?" he asked hoarsely. "No trick," Ethan said, rotating the topology bloom like it was a 3D model in a software he wasn't embarrassed to use. "Ignore the time distortion. It's lying to you. The physical geometry is honest. It's a Rubik's Cube with extra dimensions." Marr put both lower hands on the plinth for balance. 87 years, he repeated, because numbers comforted him, even when they made things worse. "We argued about metaphysics for 87 years. They brought out a Vanek resonance rod rumored to hum the past into present. Ethan tapped it with a knuckle, listened, then rapped it against the plinth in 3 different places. It replied in the tone of a fork that knows soup is coming. A faint hollow appeared, faint impressions, not images, like fingerprints of time. He shrugged. "It's a stethoscope," he said. "You put it against a thing, it tells you what's rattling in there." They produced a Thasian archive bead the size of a pea and the weight of a thesis. Ethan rolled it across his palm and squinted at nothing. "Anti-tamper," he decided. He flicked it, lightly, exactly once. It uncurled into an index tree, each branch opening to a new branch until the metaphor got bored with itself and became a table of contents. 17-dimensional harmonic convergence. Tivrek muttered, scribbling in a graph language he'd invented during a lonely winter. He's improvising a mathematics that isn't supposed to improvise. Exists, Ethan corrected mildly. You just have to hum along. Outside, a crowd had formed into stations. Those watching through the glass, those streaming to their networks, those who had decided to start selling snacks because capitalism is the default human response to amazement. A concession drone arrived with a basket of bao. Someone began a chant that didn't catch on because academic institutions do not chant. They convene. A representative from station security arrived and announced that everything looked extremely illegal. The dean informed him without heat that so was he. He stayed, ate a bao, and turned on his lapel camera. Midway through hour 2, Yilth stopped vibrating. He sat upright, tendrils unfurling with the steady grace of something that had realized it was improbably going to survive. He wrote with neat, deliberate letters. Hypothesis. We have been addressing tools as temples. Solution. Treat them like tools. Then, after a moment, ask humans if they have other sayings. He circled horses and drew another horse. It wasn't better, but it was happier. Zerai filled 4 notebooks. The 5th began with reframe. Tactile intelligence as primary methodology. Instruments as confirmatory, not prescriptive. The page looked like a rebellion that had decided to prepare minutes. Tivrek's favorite scanner, the one with a retro dial and an inheritance complex, finally gave up and displayed, in Old Quorn. Have you tried asking it nicely? Next, Dean Relvar said, and produced an object that looked like an insult to causality. Mahirian Cascade, she said, untouched. We didn't know where to begin.
Ethan smiled at it like you do at a dog that doesn't yet know it belongs to you. You begin at the end, he said, and did, and the cascade obligingly walked itself backward into clarity. 3 hours in, the breakthrough table was a city of lit windows. The air carried the smell of warm metal, ionized hope, and the lingering scent of the bao. The station lights dipped twice, embarrassed, and then recovered, as if they'd just tripped on their own feet. The dean set down her slate. "Mr. Walker," she said, formal and precise, which in administrative dialect translates to, "We are about to do a thing with consequences. You have produced more actionable understanding in an afternoon than we have in a century. I am prepared to offer you immediate affiliation, a personal lab, a budget that will make you irresponsible, and the right to ignore anyone who tells you no without a reason that would make a star blush." Ethan adjusted the strap of his bag. "That's... wow," he said, in the tone of someone who has been handed keys to a city when he came in for a sandwich. "I appreciate it. I really do. But I'm a business major, marketing and management. I'm taking this class because my advisor said I needed a cultural science elective, and this met on Tuesdays." He winced. "I'm planning to open a restaurant when I graduate." There are silences, and then there are silences that hold up a hand and ask time to wait outside. "A restaurant," Professor Marr repeated, tasting each syllable like a deliberate poison. His antennae drooped at an angle that suggested he might put them in a drawer and forget they existed. "Fusion," Ethan added, "because sharing dreams is a human compulsion. I make a really good grilled cheese." One of Tivrek's lesser scanners, overwhelmed by the competing demands of science and destiny, produced a moan like a whale that had read the course catalogue and decided to major in poetry. Dean Relvar did not sigh.
High office offers few opportunities to sigh. She made a note instead. Recruit. Human generalist cognition. New track? Then, aloud. What grade would you like in this course, mister? Walker. Ethan brightened with the uncomplicated joy of a man being handed certainty. An A would be great, he said. Done, said the dean, and somewhere a registrar woke violently and didn't know why. Ethan began backing out of the radius of everyone's expectations. So, I can go? My friends are waiting. We're supposed to try the noodle place in Ring 3. Yes, Relvar said. Then, with the caution of someone who had learned today that Pandora had a practical sense of humor. One more. She lifted a small wooden box from the briefcase she had not once put down. It was plain, not aggressively so, but with the simple dignity of a useful thing. A faint energy shimmer hugged its seams like a polite doorman. This has been in our possession for 4 centuries, she said. We have no idea what it does. Ethan took it. It was light. The grain told him it had been held often by someone who had loved it without fanfare. He pressed a seam. The latch released with a sigh of ease no scanner could detect, because there is no algorithm for, of course. Inside, in a tidy compartment, lay a small collection of preserved nuts, dried fruit, and discs of something like bread. A note shimmered up in the faintest holographs. A name, a date, a laugh of a message. Remember to eat. It's a lunchbox, Ethan said. No one said anything. Around the room, 17 brilliant minds adjusted their orbital paths. Sarai made a noise that might, in other circumstances, have been a laugh. Tivrek wrote, "Not everything becomes important by being old." Yilth put his tendrils over his face and shook with something like happiness. Ethan sniffed, then stopped, because he could hear a dozen species inhale in warning. "Not eating it," he promised. "I have boundaries." He closed the box carefully, as if closing a friend's door. He looked at the breakthrough table. The open petals, the humming cores, the dignified little interfaces shining like street lamps after rain. "I think," he said, "you might be overcomplicating some of this." He slung his bag over his shoulder, gave an awkward human wave that translated to half the room as blessings upon your household, and to the other half as do you need help moving furniture, and headed for the exit. He made it 3 steps. "Mr. Walker," Dean Relvar called, and the universe, which appreciates good timing, dimmed the station lights in a small throat clearing. "Yes?" Relvar looked at the table, at the door, at the crowd, at the way the station's power grid was starting to pay attention to this room, like a parent to an energetic toddler. "We should probably learn how to turn all of this off," she said. As if on cue, a distant alarm began to consider its options. It opted for a tone that had been tuned by a committee to communicate urgency without inciting rebellion. Professor Marr placed a gentle hand on the Enigma's open petal, as if to demonstrate that he could, in fact, touch it now without dissolving into shame. "With respect," he said quietly, reverent in a new way, "perhaps we should ask Mr. Walker to show us how to close them without forgetting how to open them." Ethan looked at the human thing he had done and the alien thing he had been asked to keep doing. He thought of the noodle place in Ring 3 and the gas giant turning like a giant's eye outside the station, and the way the Enigma had felt in his hands like a puzzle that wanted to be solved. "Okay," he said. "Quick lesson, then lunch." They gathered close. Sarai, stylus poised but no longer trembling. Tivrek, for once not interposing a device between himself and the world,
Yilth, tendrils steady, eyes wide. The dean leaned in, the impossible luxury of attention fully offered. Marr listened like a man who had finally met the language his cathedral was written in. "Rule 1, Ethan said, hands hovering over the Enigma's petals. "Don't treat it like a temple. Treat it like a wrench." Sarai wrote it down. Then, on a fresh page, in large letters, "Wrench." "And Rule 2? Tivrek asked. Ethan smiled. "If you hear hoofbeats," he said, because some traditions deserve to be shared, "think horses." "Not razor beasts," Yilth whispered, and drew a horse that, this time, looked like it might carry you somewhere. The alarms kept murmuring, polite as always. The gas giant rolled its slow, glorious eye. Orialis Station, with its committees and chimes, adjusted to a future that had become a little less sacred and a lot more useful. And Ethan Walker, human, business major, soon to be restaurateur, showed the greatest minds in a dozen star systems how to close a box without losing the nerve to open it again. He taught quickly. He left before anyone could ask him to stay. He found his friends. He ate noodles with the blunt joy of a person who has earned starch. Later, much later, he made grilled cheese for a table full of aliens who had never thought bread could be persuasive. Back in Lecture Hall 16, Professor Marr stood alone with the quiet machines. He looked at the wooden box on the corner, the lunchbox older than some nations, and he laughed, softly and well, in a way that did not need a committee's approval. "We have been making temples," he said to the low hum of a station that had agreed to keep orbiting. "Time to build workshops." He reached out and turned off the last hologram. The room darkened to an honest shade. Outside the window, the planet turned. Inside the window, a curriculum turned with it. And far down the ring, in a restaurant that did not exist yet, but would, months from now, a bell would someday chime. A human would flip a sandwich. A Kaelith professor would sit at a corner table with a Helok dean and a Clithian student and a Quorn engineer and a Thrin who had drawn so many horses he forgot what fear felt like. They would argue about tools. They would argue about temples. They would eat. They would hum to the cutlery, because that is how you learn what it wants to be. On Orialis Station, in the orbit of a patient gas giant, the future arrived with a click.